We'd like to acknowledge that we're recording this video on Aboriginal lands. I'm in the Blue Mountains on Gundungurra and Darug country.
And I'm in Canberra on Ngunnawal country.
We pay our respects to elders past and present.
So in this video, we're going to really focus on the ways in which water and climate have been understood as either interconnected or as separate in Australian environmental history. And we're going to explore some of the implications of these views.
To briefly introduce ourselves, we're both environmental historians. I'm a senior lecturer at Macquarie University in Sydney.
And I'm an associate professor at the Australian National University in Canberra.
We've both focused on water and climate histories in our research. Ruth, what have been some of the connections between water and climate that you've looked at in your research?
Well, I've been really interested in how people in the southwest of the continent, so a region expanding from Geraldton down to Esperance, have been coming to terms with the fact that their climate has been changing since the 1970s. They're in the thick of a drying trend, and that's really challenged and forced them to think a little bit more about their colonial water cultures that have been developing since the early 19th century and really forced all sorts of changes in the suburbs, in rural areas, also in terms of the ways in which water is managed more generally. What about you, Emily?
Well, one thing I was quite struck by when I was researching histories of floods in the Murray-Darling Basin was the way colonial government meteorologists in the late 19th century went about their work, which centrally connected water and climate. It included many things we might expect, like observations and measurements of the weather, but it also included gathering observations from locals along rivers like the Darling in New South Wales, including Aboriginal people, so as to gain better understandings of river flows, weather and climate. This is problematic because it was all going towards colonising projects, and it's important that we recognise that colonial scientists were not innocent in this. The ultimate goal was to be able to forecast floods and droughts so as to better protect colonial settlements and infrastructure, and also aid the establishment and expansion of colonial agriculture in these areas, which, as Cameron Muir has shown, was seen as difficult by the government. Meteorologists who collected these sort of accounts, like Henry Chamberlain Russell, had real trouble getting this information accepted as data by a wider and rapidly professionalising scientific community. There are lots of other examples, of course, of research showing these sort of interconnections. Ruth, what is some of the innovative work in this area?
I've really enjoyed looking at Rebecca Jones's work, where she's using farmers' diaries to give us a much more intimate and personal insight into the ways in which Australian farmers have historically dealt with and remembered drought and dry periods in their histories. What about you, Emily?
Well, it's really hard to choose. Chris O'Brien's done some really interesting research that complicates Western understandings of seasons in the top end of Australia as being simply wet and dry. He does this by engaging with Aboriginal people's understandings of seasonality in various regions there, which are much more nuanced and indicate there are many more seasons. These are marked by the behaviours of particular animals, changes in plants, and so on. To finish off, Ruth, what do you think are some of the key ways that these connections between water and climate are happening today?
Well, I think a lot of the issues we've touched on today are still unresolved. Settler Australians are still trying to come to terms with the rhythms of the continent and its climates. But what we're really seeing is the ways in which climate change is manifesting in all kinds of ways when it comes to fresh water.
Yes, indeed. And I think we can certainly see these issues playing out in places like the Murray-Darling Basin, which is just coming out of a very long drought and where climate change is really manifesting. But that needs a whole other video.
That's right. Well, that's going to bring us to the end of this discussion on water and climate in Australian environmental history. Now, if you're keen to explore any of the publications and references that we have mentioned today, do follow up these sources on your screen now. Thank you so much for joining us.